Okay, 5 o'clock.
We're live.
Yeah, we're live. So we have, at the moment, already some people. I guess we wait a little bit before starting, right?
Yes, let's wait a little bit more for more people to pour in here. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are.
Welcome, welcome. Mr. Bill, good to see you. Good to read you. Okay. Ioannis, Nicola, as well. Good to read you. Buenos días in Mexico. Mr. Mark. Okay, so it's quite diverse, huh? From the US, from Central Europe, from Japan. Yeah, Naoki. Alessandro.
Yeah, maybe while we wait, Koffi is starting his presentation. A few housekeeping items. As always, if you have been with webinars with us before, you might know that. But anyway, as always, there's going to be a recording of this, which is made available. However, give us some time, please. It will take a little bit until this is available. And as always, we do have Q&A after it. And but feel also please free to ask question or post questions already during the presentation. However, we will address those only after the presentation is over. Does it work for you, Koffi?
Yeah,
afterwards. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, cool. Then I think the number of additional attendees is not growing that much, so maybe
I could get started.
Yes, you start and I shut up.
Okay. So thanks, Sebastian, for the housekeeping. So Sebastian will be here as the scientific voice, right? I will be in charge of the presentation mainly, okay? So he'll be there to perhaps add some precision when it's needed. Okay, so I'm quite happy this evening to talk about one of the hottest topics out here, which is how to measure VLamax from submax efforts. And we thought that it could be pretty cool to have this focus session to dive a little bit deeper into this topic. And to do that, so here is the menu. We will start with a fresh and brief reminder about VLamax. And then
Koffi, sorry to interrupt really quick. We don't see your menu. You need to switch to presenter mode, please. Which is the overview on the left-hand side and the workable one. Okay, can you maybe go to presenter mode so that we can see it full screen?
I thought I was, which is strange. Wait a second, presenter view.
While you do that, I'm going to answer the first question here from Selam. Thanks again, Selam. Selam for. So as we just mentioned, in case you dropped in later, the recording will be made available afterwards. Give us a little bit of time, please. It will take a little bit until we have that ready. And yeah, but you will get an email notification once this is ready.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's try it like this. What about now?
Nope. Yeah, stop present. Yes, that's good. Okay, so now let's get started for real.
Okay, excellent. So how are we going to dive into this topic? We will start with a fresh and brief reminder about VLamax, and then directly we will dive into the main challenges associated with the initial and classic method to approximate VLamax. And the core as well of the presentation will be obviously why and how we can get VLamax from submax effort. Okay, and then please stay with us because we have some surprise for you at the end of the presentation. And as Sebastian already mentioned, we will take the time for Q&A at the very end. Okay, so let's get started. VLamax, I think it's still very, very important to make sure that we are all on the same page. And when we talk about VLamax, we are really talking about maximum rate of lactate production. Okay, and sometimes, as I like to call it, you could see it as the glycolytic brother of VO2max. And that's important because, as most of you already know, the higher your VLamax is, the higher your power or your speed you can produce, or your athletes can produce. But that's not only important for that, because with the VO2max, the VLamax mainly compose, let's say, your anaerobic threshold. And it means that depending on the type of competition you are doing or your athletes are performing, perhaps you are not only interested to have a high VLamax. Okay, so you better want to measure it. Now, that being said, how do we do that? That's one of the key questions of the presentation. Already in the 90s, there was an idea about approximate VLamax using this equation. And as you can see, you needed to measure maximum blood lactate after the effort, and as well blood lactate before the effort. And then you have as well the t-test, so the duration of the test, which was 15 seconds, a 15-second sprint, especially because above that duration, you might see a drop in pH with the acidosis getting more important, more present, and this starts to inhibit the glycolysis and then consequently reducing the VLamax. So we want to stay along this line. And the last parameter here of this equation is the famous TLAC, which means here alactic time interval. And specifically, to get a little bit more specific, that's the non-reversible and significant drop in power, and especially by 3.5%. Okay, we'll get back to that because that's quite an important aspect of this method when we will discuss the challenges. With that, let's start with the first ones, the first challenges. So, as you can see on this image, you have a cyclist seated on a cycling ergometer. So what I want to say here is that initially the method was designed for cycling using an SRM ergometer with specific gearing, which took it into account gender, body composition, and as well athlete type. So this is a very important point already to bear in mind. Huh? If you do not have these settings and this kind of assessment environment, so to say, then it already starts to get complicated. Other challenges. Perhaps Sebastian, here you can already chime in to mention to discuss a little bit more about those challenges here, which are related to the equation. I'm not sure if he's still here.
Yeah. Sorry, I just needed to unmute myself. Yeah. So the first bullet point here, where you say lactate over time. What is important to note here, basically what you do, you look at the total amount of lactate which has been accumulated and divide it by the time. So if you think about the lactate production curve, right, if you would plot the time on the x-axis and you would see the glycolytic power increase and then decrease or like level off, so to speak. The amount of lactate, so to speak, is the equivalent of the area below the curve. And so what I'm trying to say here is that you can get a certain amount of lactate produced in that time with, somewhat different peak lactate production rates. And the VLamax should aim to be the peak lactate production rate. So mathematically, or not, but technically, so to speak, you would have to mention that this formula is more doing an average lactate production during a 15-second sprint instead of the real or a peak lactate production during the sprint. The second bullet point states that the lactate production doesn't end immediately at the end of the sprint, which is often forgot. But if you look at the formula, this is what it implies, right? It is the duration of the test minus this alactic time. And as everything in living organisms and therefore also in humans, there are no like rectangle functions, right? It's obviously not that anything like also the same goes for VO2, as you know, right? VO2 kinetics are not rectangle functions, not like you start exercising, VO2 goes up vertically, stays horizontal, and then stops. And the same is for the glycolytic rate. So at the end of the test, the glycolysis does not stop at the very same second. And so that is not represented in this equation. And this is one aspect that makes this equation somewhat inaccurate. The biggest shortcoming is maybe the third one, that if you look at this equation, this alactic time is kind of implying that the glycolysis starts after a certain time, right? So the t-test means the duration of the full effort. So for example, 15 seconds. And then the idea is that, in the beginning, you primarily use, for example, creatine phosphate, and therefore you don't use as much glycolysis, and therefore there's this alactic time. But the problem is, glycolysis is not related by time, right? If I would now leave this room and get myself a coffee, then it's not that glycolysis kicks in halfway on my way to the coffee machine or when I arrive at the coffee machine. It's basically not kicking in because the intensity is not high enough. And this is a problem, that the concept of alactic time, and I think Koffi will get to that when he looks at methodology challenges of this, again, very simplified equation, is that it implies that the intensity is always maximum. And that is somewhat of a challenge, as Koffi is going to show, okay? And related to that is the last one. Something that is often overlooked, especially when people try to apply this concept to other sports like running or swimming or skiing or whatsoever. The beauty of doing it on an ergometer, or specifically on an SRM ergometer, is that it's possible to apply certain settings to the ergometer to hopefully enable the athlete to reach peak power. And besides, it's kind of, well, self-explanatory that you want the highest peak power in an all-out sprint. It is also that the breakdown of creatine phosphate in the beginning of the sprint. So the more power you put out, or the athlete puts out, the more creatine phosphate is going to be used. The breakdown of creatine phosphate introduces an increase in pH values. So that's what is called metabolic alkalosis. And you could understand it in a way there's this increase in pH acts actually as a buffer. So let's say intramuscular pH levels is 7.1, and then to paint you a picture, 2 seconds into the sprint, intramuscular pH might be 7.2. So it might be slightly increased, and therefore you have this, so to speak, extra buffer, which then enables you to really activate glycolysis. Because as Koffi already said, a drop in pH level inhibits glycolysis. So if you can start with a higher pH, basically, because the ergometer setting was all good, if you can start with a higher pH value because of the breakdown of creatine phosphate, because the ergometer was set up in a way that the athlete can reach high peak power, then you start at a higher pH, so to speak, and therefore you can reach higher glycolytic rates, which obviously is what you would need to get a real VLamax. So yeah, this is on those 4 ones here. Koffi, you want to take over again?
Yeah. Thanks very much, Sebastian. Let's move forward. And you already start to mention a little bit about this aspect as well. But if we go back to lactate time, that's important to bear in mind that this is something which change as well with the time to reach peak power. If we consider two athlete types, let's say a sprinter type, so it will obviously reach peak power quite earlier, especially if we compare that to an endurance type of athlete, and this will have an impact on the whole equation, because having earlier time to reach power will shorten the lactate time, because here you will have a bigger delta, and this will lead to a lower calculated VLamax. And it will be actually the contrary for an endurance type of athlete, because the lactate time will be longer. So this will lead to a lower delta and then a higher calculated VLamax. So when we start to consider athlete types in regard to this equation, then we start to figure out that things can be quite complicated. So that's another aspect to bear in mind. And another one as well, which is hopefully quite clear, is this example with the same athlete using different gearing. So as you can see on the first graph, the upper first graph, you see a clear drops in power on the green curve. Okay, and this would define the lactate time at the moment where power drops here significantly, as we said. And this was performed with a specific gearing. And then changing the gearing, you can see on the lower graph, the green curve again, and you can see the drop in power occurring much later, much after. and this actually lengthens the lactic time. So that's another important aspect here to consider. The gearing might mess up as well the lactic time, and this will have an impact on the calculated VLamax. If you want to have a deeper dive into these topics, we have on our e-college some courses that would help you to understand that a little bit deeper, because we are just giving you now an overview. So that's a little bit the overall idea. So now, that being said, if we take into consideration these challenges, what do we do? Either we want to continue with the same method, or we want perhaps to consider another one. And here, a suggestion for you, which is considering the submaximum efforts as a method to calculate VLamax. And from a high perspective point of view, before Sebastian dive a little bit deeper into the more technical details, that's feasible because there is a very close or tight relationship between the maximum rate of lactate production and the lactate production rate at or in submaximum intensities. And with that, Sebastian, you can take over to dive a little bit deeper regarding further explanation.
Yeah, so that is going to be a little bit, well, so bear with me, it's going to be a little bit technical here. However, the ironic part of it is that anybody of you who measures lactate is basically using this concept every time you measure lactate, because this is how, that's partly, or you could argue this is a little bit how a lactate analyzer works. So what you see on the left-hand graph here is, well, first year studying biology or biochemistry in university, or maybe even school knowledge. That is that the reaction of any enzyme-driven reaction, sorry for the wording. So, for example, in metabolism, right? Glycolysis is, I don't know, approximately 8 enzymes or something. So that's the flux rate, the reaction speed of any enzyme-driven reaction is determined by the maximum reaction speed. In enzyme kinetics, where this comes from, the maximum reaction speed is called Vmax, which is where the term VLamax comes from. So the writing with a dot on top of it, little side note here, is not correct, but the V, that's a capital V, basically comes from the commonly used enzyme kinetics formula, where Vmax describes the maximum reaction speed. And this is what you see on the y-axis here on the left graph. And on the x-axis, you see some kind of trigger. In normal enzymes reactions, this is substrate concentration. Again, going back to the sprint text example, it's not time, right? So whatever you could ask, so basically how to understand that is whatever drives, whatever triggers, in our case, a glycolysis to be activated, okay, at a certain drive, of a certain amount of trigger, right? For example, substrate concentration. So substrate could be fructose 1,6-B phosphate, for example, drives glycolysis. So you could put this, the concentration of fructose 1,6-B phosphate on the x-axis here. And then basically what the graph tells you is that, if you would say this is two athletes here, the athlete with the higher glycolytic enzyme concentration is the blue one, and the athlete with the lower enzymatic enzyme concentration is the green one. And what it tells you is that the guy with the higher maximum enzymatic activity or concentration has the higher reaction speed has the higher flux rates, the higher production speed in our case of lactate or glycolytic turnover at any submaximum condition, right? You can see that always the blue graph is higher than the green graph. And again, this is basic knowledge, and that is not directly, but partly as a lactate meter works, right? I mean, based on enzyme kinetics, so to speak. And the less technical, less biochemical relation here, you can see on the right-hand graph, and that's also where the reference here below from Wackerhage et al. Is useful. What you see here on the right-hand side is actually lactate concentration as a function of power output, so normal lactate profile curve. And the interesting piece here is that this is real data from a step test. And these two athletes are about the same body weight by, I don't know, 1 kilogram, so 1.5. So you could really neglect it, you know, when it comes to interpreting lactate curves. And the other interesting piece is that they have the same VO2 max. So as Koffi is going to show, obviously VO2 max or oxygen uptake is what you need to combust lactate. So the aerobic power, so to speak, is the same, or the aerobic capacity, power would be more precise, whatever we'll call it, is the same by, I think, 50 milliliters or something. It was the same. And you can see that the athlete with the higher VLamax has the left shift of the lactate profile curve or the lactate concentration curve, which is again what you see in this paper cited here from 2022. And so this kind of fits to this biochemical explanation, right? So if you have a guy with a higher VLamax based on enzyme kinetics, again, first year biochemistry, so it's not nothing fancy that we just made up here. The guy with a higher maximum reaction speed and therefore likely higher enzyme concentration, and you could argue whatever, more fast twitch fibers and so on and so forth, will produce more lactate at every single power output, at every single intensity. And because they have the same lactate combustion capacity, simplified speaking, by having the same VO2 max, this results in a higher concentration. And this is basically what causes a left shift here. And again, so this is kind of the, let's say, non-biochemical, non-theoretical proof that you can see in everyday performance diagnostics work, so to speak, when you have an example like this, where you can directly compare two athletes who have in almost all aspects the same numbers, except for VLamax. So I hope that this helps to understand, or hopefully gives you the explanation why a higher VLamax means higher lactate concentration and everything else that comes from it, like higher carbohydrate combustion, and we could go on, right? So yeah, back to you, Koffi.
Thanks. And on this one, we wanted to show you how small the bias and the standard deviation is when you want to determine VLamax using 3 submax efforts of 6 minutes. And I think, Sebastian, it was a simulation, correct?
No, so this is basically we use edge cases, right? So we use the most extreme cases you could imagine. So super low or relatively low VO2 max, very high VLamax. So almost cases use basically almost impossible to find, you could argue, in real world conditions. I mean, 30 and 0.2 maybe yes, 30 and 1.0, I mean, yeah, maybe. Anyway, so we use these edge cases, and we use a device error, so the error of the measurements, okay? And so we apply fluctuations, right? So we say this is a lactate curve of, for example, somebody with a VO2 max of 30 and a VLamax of 0.2. And now and this is basically, I think, 500 different error scenarios. So if you have 500 different distributed errors in power output and in lactate measured, what would be the accuracy of your VLamax that you get from submaximum efforts? And this is what you see here.
Excellent. Thanks again for these details. Let's move forward. And here, try to highlight it as well in a case regarding reliability of measurement for VLamax. So it was a case with 2 groups of 16 participants. And as you can see, when they are tested twice, you can see that there is a very non-significant small variation of the value of VLamax, which help us to understand that it's quite reliable. Huh? Okay, now let's be a little bit more concrete. Here, as you can see, that's one of the, let's say, typical protocol that we suggest to get VLamax from Submax efforts. So you can see that the overall view looks pretty much like a step test, even if instead of that you have some recovery period in between the steps, okay, and that you have as well all out, because what you get from this protocol is not only VLamax but other metrics as well, such as VO2 max and anaerobic threshold, for example, to name a few. So what you need to bear in mind here is that the minimum are 3 steps, and you want as well your athletes to elicit a maximum lactate concentration of 2.5 after the effort. And because you are going to modify the intensity, you're going to increase the intensity. If you follow this specific order, then the lactate concentration is going to change. And as a recommendation, this is what we usually recommend. So 0.4, between 0.4 and 0.7 for cycling, watt per kilo, and between 0.4 and 0.65 meter per second for running. So hopefully this starts as a way to clarify the more concrete or practical view of the topic. Now, once you do that, you are ready. You have your data of your protocol, and you want to upload that into the software. Bear in mind that you are not left alone. You are not left into the wild. Okay, therefore, I wanted to put here a small reminder. You can always use the wisdom of Yoda Master. So, long story short, in the app, you have the possibility to check the quality of your raw data. And this is something which is really, really important. To try to make it simple here, on the left graph, what you see are generic lactate curves before optimization, right? So the colors illustrate the different intensities here in cycling, and the dots are the peak of lactate concentrations that you measured in post-effort. Okay, and on the right-hand side, on the right graph, what you can see is the optimization. So it means that the algorithm understand now or decipher the lactate production and combustion behind the lactate concentration. And again, long story short, the closer your dots are from the lines, the better it is. So bear in mind you have that possibility to check your raw data. You are not slave here. You are still responsible of the data that you put in. Very, very important. Speaking about accuracy, speaking about fitting, Sebastian, you wanted to add something, perhaps?
Yeah, if you can go back one slide, because while you were presenting, I was answering some of the questions here in the chat. And I would like to go back to those and to answer a few things that came up in the question, and I think that always come up, right? So we had a question, for example, if the lactate shuttle theory or the lactate shuttle itself is not kind of like, you know, throwing off this some of the concepts here, and there's some other things that are always like, you know, often overlooked. So what Koffi showed here in this graph, when we recalculate, that's basically what you see here, right? Recalculating lactate concentration, and you can see how accurate, in the right picture, you can see how accurate or not accurate it is to recalculate the measured lactate concentration. What is included here, so what this respects, it is related to the body composition of the athlete, right? So this is very often overlooked. We speak about lactate, and we very quick talk about 4 millimoles, 3 millimoles, but it's not millimoles. It's millimoles per liter. So the lactate dilutes in water, and so therefore you need to have the body composition here to make an accurate you know, calculation. You have to know the lactate dilution space. And I could share some fun anecdotes here where we had people with more water than expected, and then the fitting is off, and so on and so forth a little bit. So when you fix the body composition here, the lactate concentrations that you measured, if you leave out the body composition and say, okay, this is checked, right? Then the lactate concentration that you measure is a result of the lactate production, right? I mean, the stuff has to come from somewhere, and the lactate combustion, which includes, to answer this question again, which includes something like a lactate shuttle, because in the combustion it doesn't really matter if the lactate is directly transported into the mitochondria. It first goes via pyruvate, right? For the total combustion rate, it doesn't really matter, so to speak, how the transport looks like here. So this is taken into account. So to make this very clear, it's not that we sit here and say, yeah, we can use lactate concentration and this is the same as lactate production, right? No. The concentration is the result of the production and the combustion, and together with the body composition, this is all taken into account when this processing of the data happens, okay? So anybody who thinks like, yeah, but that's, you know, cannot work because there's oxygen uptake and there's combustion, and therefore, you know, it's all not that easy. It is, you know, that is actually baked in here. So just to make this clear, and to go back to these questions here about the lactate shuttle. Yeah, and so then, Koffi, if you want to move to the next slide, you said you have to have a little bit of a spoiler alert. Yeah, so this fitting graph, Koffi, yeah, so this fitting graph that you have seen is only part of the story. What we are working on, and what you will see soon here, and myself being a little bit nerdy, maybe I'm very excited about that. You will see an accuracy in a check of the accuracy of your results, taking into account the error of measurement. So let me explain this graph first, okay? So in this example that Koffi showed in a cycling test, it could also be a speed test using GPS or swimming or ski ergometers or whatever, right? You have obviously an error of measurement in your devices, right? Obviously a power meter is 2, 3, 4% off whatsoever, and the lactate meter is off, right? And so there's an error in your measurement. And what we did is we searched the literature for all validation and accuracy checks of all the devices, all handheld lactate meters, VO2 analyzers, power meters, so on and so forth. And there is a standard error, right? So there is like a standard error, whatever, of, just to make an example, of 2%, let's say, in a power meter, right? And this is what you see here on the x-axis, right? Error in your power or speed measurement. And then there's a standard error in the lactate meter that you use, depending on which lactate meter it is, right? Let's say, just making this up now, 0.4 millimoles, okay? Would be an error of 1. And so what's going to happen, what we're working on, as you can see in this graph, we are pretty far with that, is whenever you process test data with INSCYD, we are going to apply this error from your measurement devices, different errors. The normal error, right? The standard error that you can find. And as you can see, also half the error, which would be 0.5 on the axis, or double the error, that would be 2.0. And then check how much does this affect the outcome, the result of the VLamax that you will get. Okay, because the question, so to speak, that we want to answer with that is, okay, you get the VLamax as a result that makes this up of 0.5, right? What is the range? What range can you expect? Is it 0.5? Is it plus minus 0.05, which is what you find as reliability in the literature, right? So can it be 0.45 then, or 0.55, or is it, how accurate is it basically? And this is what this graph tells you. So in this graph here, in this example, you can see that with a standard error of 1, so your standard error in power and your standard error in lactate, right? The VLamax result that you get has an accuracy lower, or a variation in there, variance in there, lower than 0.05, which is the best what you could expect, basically. Okay. Yes, this is where Koffi is showing. Okay. And then you can see, but if my error is higher, right, how much error would I expect? And this is in the yellow and the red one. And the idea here, there's also going to be a dumbed down, a simplified version of that, where we just show red, green, and yellow. But the idea really is to be able to show and prove before you accept the result, before you say, yeah, this is a test I want to add to my database, that you know exactly and you can be confident that how accurate the data is. So you can either accept or decline it. And why I'm somewhat fired up about it is because I think there's no such thing out there yet where, even when you do a normal lactate profile test, right, if you just make a normal lactate profile curve, the error of the measurement is not really considered, right? And I think therefore it's a really good add-on to be able to understand the error of your devices and what this does actually to your results, right? Because of course, with a VO2 analyzer, with everything, there's an error. So let's look at that. So that's this one. We already presented it to some of you and so on and so forth, and we're going to test it. Yeah, and then the next one, which maybe is even more exciting for most of you, is you might say, okay, well, this looks like exactly what is new about this one. This looks exactly like the current protocol. No, it's not. What you see here is a step test. So we are currently working, so we already have the mass for that. We are just running validation studies with some external partners, because as you know, nothing goes live without at least internal, but in best case also external validation. We are working on a step test protocol where you can basically use somewhat of a conventional step test, which is maybe slightly modified. So you go up to approximately, let's say, threshold, a little bit above threshold, and then stop the test and then just do one all-out effort. And as you can see with the number of blood drops here, it will require significant less lactate samples. And because you don't have the recovery periods in between the efforts, it's also significant faster. We already did this about 2 weeks ago with the US triathlon national team. And we went down to like 20 minutes for a bike test and like 35 minutes for a swim test. But this was because we also used VO2 measurements here. So that's something we are pretty excited about. And again, the mass is there. We are running the validations. And if all goes well, then it's not going to take too long until you're going to see that, obviously in combination with this accuracy check, so that you can be aware of the accuracy, and you can be certain how good your results are. So yeah, that's a little bit the outlook, what we are working on. So still keeping busy. And I think, I don't know, Koffi, if you have another slide, or do you want to go Q&A?
No, I think we can, those are really massive improvements. And hopefully what we presented really clarify a little bit the whole topic. Huh? And now this is time for Q&A, guys, huh? For both of you.
Yeah, I had the time or Koffi to already read a few questions here, but before we jump to that, please bring in more questions, right? You see the chat here. As I said, I answered a few along the way, but it's very cool to ask more questions. So bring it up, type more questions while we start answering. Okay.
Excellent. I cannot see yet the questions because I'm still in.
Okay. Yeah. So let me answer that. So I'm going to start from the top here with the open one. Hannes Burger asking, couldn't it be that when I reach the power peak earlier in the sprint test, so going back to the sprint test methodology, that the overall lactate at the end is also slightly higher, resulting in the same calculated VLamax? Well, it could. It depends on why you reach peak power earlier. The problem is that, well, the idea of the sprint test is you need to set up the ergometer that enables the athlete to reach peak power. And if you think about it, if you reach peak power too early, then beyond that time point when you reach peak power, you maybe run out of gears, or you maybe could have, so to speak, you could have reached. There are a lot of publications about it in the track sprint and track cycling, by the way. You could have reached higher power if you would have a different gear, right? Because the peak power is a function of the cadence also. That could be one scenario. The other scenario is that you reach peak power very late, as Koffi showed, and then the absolute power is lower just because it comes so late that you don't have the same force. You're basically, simplified speaking, you're already fatigued, right? Does it result in a higher VLamax? Normally not, because when you reach peak power earlier, the alactic time becomes shorter, and therefore the denominator is bigger. So let's say you divide 10 millimoles by either 12 seconds or by 14 or 10 seconds, then the VLamax gets calculated lower because you divide it by a longer time duration, right? Good question here from Diroc, Mathieu. The impact of supplements on VLamax outcome, for instance, bicarbonate, creatine, beta-alanine. Great question. Creatine has been explored. There's no really a difference. Bicarbonate, I would not expect that, because bicarbonate primarily works on a blood level, right? In terms of buffering, and at least in the 15-second sprints, it would be too short. And beta-alanine could have an effect in the sprint tests, because it works on a muscular level and therefore could do that. Koffi, can you go back one slide here for me real quick to the previous protocol?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. No, the one with the new protocol. Yeah, to paint you the full picture here, this is a big benefit of doing it in submax efforts. If you read here the protocol, that is dealing with lactate concentrations primarily below 3.5. So very low lactate where pH is relatively stable, and therefore there's no effect of buffering capacity. So the big benefit of this one, and I can say that because we are looking at buffering capacity when we calculate these, when we calculate VLamax. The big benefit of this one is if you calculate VLamax at the lower intensities with lower lactate concentration, these impacts of increased buffering capacity by beta-alanine do not do anything. So they don't affect the results. LT1, what's about LT1? Yes. I don't want to give you a timeline, but it should be relatively soon. Well, now I'm giving a timeline. I would say by the end of the year, most definitely, and it could be one of the most earlier things. So it could be earlier than this protocol, and it could be earlier than the accuracy check. Actually, then when you see LT1, Brian, to answer this question. Excellent question here from Matt McNamara. What's the reasonable interval to test, retest to see changes? Difficult. You can, for example, do a very high calorie restricted diet and jump on a ketogenic diet. So ketogenic diet was not sufficient calorie intake, and you will see a drop in VLamax within 2 weeks. You can do a lot of sprint training with like normal diet or not changing the diet, and you can see a difference in VLamax within 6 weeks. And you cannot change a lot about your training, and then you will not see any change in VLamax. So I would start out with the recommendation of testing every 3 months approximately. That's normally fits the best for most people. And if you change something significant, like some kind of sprint training or diet or something, then maybe you want to test already after 1.5, 2 months. Vincent, considering 2 athletes with the same VO2 max doing the same step test but with a different VLamax, will you observe a different slope of the lactate curve, or is the slope similar with just a different inflection point? Well, that's, Koffi, I don't know if you want to go back here. It's quite some slides back, but that's exactly what we showed, right? So yeah, I think it's 1 or 2 back, the step test of athlete 1 and athlete 2.
This one, right?
Yes, this one. So I don't know, you tell me if you would see the slope is much different. I would argue that at least with my bare eye, I could not see so much of a different slope here. Interestingly, by the way, so no. I don't know. You judge yourself if you see a different slope here between athlete 1 and athlete 2. I don't. Yes, excellent question from Nicola Cadici here. Why is it in the PPD test, so where we do a sprint, why should it there be longer than 18 seconds? Love this question because I've seen people copying now 20 seconds for a VLamax test with lactate. Excellent question. The reason is very simple. Koffi was totally right when he said that, and that's also proven in the literature, right? I mean, that's where I got it from, right? So when I developed this VLamax test protocol, the sprint, the 15-second sprint in 2002, it was not that I was standing under the shower and said, oh, let's do 15 seconds, right? Like there's literature that shows that approximately at that time range of 15 seconds, glycolytic flux starts to decrease or is plateauing at least. So why does the PPD have 18 seconds or even 20 or 25? The reason is very simple. It's because you don't measure lactate, but the algorithm is calculating your VLamax at every second, right? So you upload power data recorded in a second by second, so 1 hertz recording. And then what it does, it calculates the VLamax for every second. And what we try to look for is that this calculated VLamax either plateaus or decreases, because only then we can be sure that you really got the VLamax, right? Because remember, the PPD one, because it's not using this, sorry for my wording, lousy, super simplified formula with delta lactate and delta time, the PPD looks for the peak VLamax in the sprint. And only if the sprint is longer, we can see a plateauing or a decrease of the lactate production rate, and therefore can be certain that you really got VLamax. And what I wanted to say is the difference to the one with lactate is you can do it in any gearing you want, right? Because it doesn't have this formula. It doesn't deal with lactic time, so it's somewhat independent of the gearing, and therefore it's important that it's a little bit longer to actually be able to see a decline or plateauing in VLamax to be sure that you really got a real VLamax. So that's a quality assurance thing. Brian is asking for the Submaximum protocol. Do the rest periods change based on athletes' phenotype? For example, high glycolytic athletes require more rest. Yeah. So So we do currently, with the current protocol, we recommend that the lactate concentration should drop below 3.5. Yes, here. And higher glycolytic, less aerobic fit athletes will take more time in this passive recovery. Yes. Okay, giving a second try for Hannes. Let me read this one. You showed that in higher gear, peak power is reached later, and said that could be a problem for VLamax calculation due to the different delta, right? My question is whether you have data that shows that actually results in erroneous VLamax calculation, or whether that cancels out. Okay, now I understand. So Hannes' question is, if the gearing is different, is the difference it does in alactic time, because the peak comes earlier or later, is that canceled out by different lactate concentrations? Great question. No, it's not. It's not. I think there's actually one publication that shows that, and we did a study last year. It's just not published yet, but it's on our website. If you go to our website and you go to the validation or research pages, you will see current research project, and there is one where we on purpose change the gearing of the ergometer, and you can see there's a graph actually where you can see 4 VLamax sprint tests, as they are called, right, with 4 different gears, or 3 different gears. So one was repeated to show reliability. And no, it is not canceled out by the lactate concentrations. The lactate concentrations you get after those sprints is within the error of measurement or day-to-day variation is the same. So let's say if somebody gets to 10 millimoles in a big gear, you will see 10 plus minus 0.5 in a small gear as well. And this is exactly the problem, right? Exactly the problem, because the idea of the alactic time being the irreversible peak power, drop of peak power, and also the 3.5% came from this very specific protocol in 2002, where the gearing was developed specifically for this test. But lately, and this is what we try to highlight here, lately it seems like this methodology runs on autopilot, right? Everybody just does a 15-second sprint and, it works or it doesn't work, right? People complain, it's not reliable, and other it is reliable. It depends on who you test and how you test it. But this is exactly the problem. So basically, if you think about it, well, you could put it this way. You could have, maybe it's just a thought experiment, sorry to go into rabbit hole. Imagine, Hannes, you would have an ergometer that changes the load during the test so that the power output would almost be constant. So what I'm trying to say, instead of reaching 1,200 watts and having average 800, imagine the ergometer would keep you constant at 800 watts for 15 seconds, just to make up a number. In this case, there's no alactic time, there's no peak, but of course you would still produce a lot of lactate, right? And this is what we mean with this entirely difficult, or I like to say flawed concept. Nagi is asking, if it's possible to get an almost good VLamax about different type of field tests, like the difference in percentage between 1, 3, 5, and 20 minutes test. Usually the 5 to 20 minutes test different is 20%, if bigger or lower. Well, the short answer is, if you want a real VLamax, is no. If you want to know if somebody is more 0.3 or 0.9, so if you really want to understand black and white, so really binary, yes, of course. But then I think for this, you don't need any test. You just need to look at maybe the peak power. Just from the differences, especially of the durations that you mentioned, it's all too much aerobic contribution. And it's all too much related to buffering capacity, for example, especially in the 3 and 5 minute efforts. So that's not really good. There are a few efforts to try to get a VLamax by looking at the relationship between VO2 max and how much percentage of that you can use at threshold. It's something that I looked at my thesis, for example, in 2003. The problem is it correlates. So statistically, there's a correlation between your VLamax and how much you can utilize your VO2 max at threshold at max lactate steady state. But the R square value is approximately 0.73, which means that you need to expect somewhat close to 30% of inaccuracy. So you can say my VLamax is 0.5, but it might be 0.7 or it might be 0.435 or something. So not at least for our standards, something that we could recommend doing. Ryan, will submaximal VLamax testing show up in PPD testing process that don't use lactate samples? I'm not sure if I understand the question correct. So submaximal VLamax testing will always require lactate. So it's either all out, no lactate, or it is lactate, and then you don't have to go all out. Yeah. So Mattia asked that about the fractional uses of VO2 max at threshold. So yeah, I think I answered that, right? So you do get a VLamax, but remember, these almost 30% variation is related to a constant load gold standard MLSS. If you add the 5% error that you have from a step test, then yeah, you could expect you get a VLamax, which is plus minus 40%-ish. So at least to our standards, that's not good enough, because any any change by training there is you will not see with this methodology. Is just looking at the percentage, and that's also because if you think about the accuracy in your VO2 max measurement. So, for example, if you assume in the best case your VO2 max measurement is plus minus 2.5 or 3%. The error sensitivity, the error propagation of that is, if in this methodology, if you have an error of 2.5–3% in VO2 max, the error that you get for that in VLamax is approximately 5-fold. So you get like 12 to 15% only by the normal accuracy of your VO2 max measurement. So running almost out of question, but that's fun. So let's see. So how will you calculate? So Emma is asking, how will you calculate the lactate 3.5 time from a max effort in a shortened step test? Okay. I think there's a misunderstanding here, Emma. So what Koffi presented was to basically say, instead of doing this sprint test, because with all these challenges and shortcomings it has, you can use only and as a standalone the submax testing without a sprint test, right? So that is, and to be fair, this is, I would say, what 99% of our INSCYD users are doing. Like almost nobody does a sprint test with lactate to measure VLamax, because it is a very challenging and very inaccurate thing to do. You can do this with INSCYD. To paint you a picture, you can upload in INSCYD, you can perform a sprint test with lactate pre-post measurement. And when you do that, when you upload this kind of data, the default is that we say, okay, there's a VLamax based off the sprint test, and the algorithm will automatically take an error margin of plus minus 30%, because this is what you can expect from just doing any kind of sprint test. An error margin of plus minus 30%, and then you use the other submaximum values or other data points that you need to bring, because this alone is not sufficient for us. We don't accept only a sprint test to get the real value. Must the testing be in a resting state or possibly after, for example, VO2 max training? Well, you just need to be rested in terms of the athlete should not be fatigued. So after 1 or 2 days of easy training or no training, and yes, you should have a decent carbo loading. So it doesn't mean that you need to do a saltine diet and eat carbohydrates only for 3 days, but it should be a decent amount of carbohydrates. The best way how to approach is do it in a normal state in which you want to use the data for. That's the most representative you can get. So if you want to use the data to inform better training programs, then test in a scenario like you would see in normal day-to-day training. So for example, if you have normally a rest day on Monday, just making it up, if you normally have a rest day on Monday and Tuesday a light training and Wednesday whatever interval training, then maybe you want to do the test on a Wednesday instead of the interval training, because then you have a very, representative scenario. One more here to go. William is asking if there's research that shows training with VLamax is more effective than traditional methods. Great question. Well, you should approach this in this way. VLamax is just a name or a label, or just a name for a in vivo metric that is a good representative of the glycolytic power. Basically what Koffi showed, for example, for glycolytic enzyme activity. And so any study or any methodology of training that is effectively training, for example, having more PFK or more fast twitch fibers or less of that, right? So any adaptation in that is a training methodology and a training that that you will see in changed VLamax values. So is this more effective? Well, it depends, right? So it depends, but basically any training methodology that is effective, changing glycolytic power of an athlete is a training method which is taking VLamax into account, either by accident, so to speak, because you just do this kind of training without measuring VLamax or knowing about it, right? Or on purpose. That's a different question. Okay, one more. Then I think as we are almost at the end here. The question is for Peter. If you have been relying on the PPD remote testing for cyclists, so no lactate at all, do you think that getting to the point of using submax lactate protocol give better results? So should I make the investment to be able to run a step test with lactate? That's an excellent question, Peter. In general, the answer is that the lactate testing is a little bit more accurate when it comes especially to VO2 max. It's 1%, 1.2%, something more accurate than the PPD test. In terms of the VLamax, maybe a little bit. The benefit is you will see in the near future some features you will only get from a lactate test. The benefit is that it's that you don't have to go all out. You can adjust the protocol, right? It's less time consuming, but of course, you need to be with the athlete and test lactate samples. So I'm not sure if this answers the question. I would argue if you test recreational amateur athletes and you can only test them remote, then maybe stay with the PPD only. If you have the chance to do lactate testing because you can be physically at the same place as an athlete and do that, it is a little bit more accurate, and you will get a few more additional features out of that. Yeah. Has submaximal testing been in practice at the World Tour level? Oh, I mean, Brian, to get that. So the submax lactate testing, yes, that is how we started. This is basically what all, as I said, 99% of our users only use the lactate submaximum testing. It has one maximum effort in it, but that's a common way. And the new protocol, which Koffi showed and I talked about, we started testing already in practice. We have a handful of users, and we did it, as I said, with the US triathlon national team. And we are currently running data from four external partners on that for a public validation study. Tobias, how significant is the difference in the accuracy in all metrics like VLamax, VO2 max, and so on between the PPD test and the lactate test and new lactate step test? Well, as I maybe already answered to Peter, in the VLamax, I don't really believe there's a big difference in theory. In practice, the risk of a PPD test doing it remotely with an athlete is always how accurate is the power meter of the athlete, right? So I could answer, yeah, if you do it on an ergometer and an SM ergometer in a lab, the PPD is as accurate as the as doing it with the lactate measurements, with Submaximum. But in a practical way, the lactate test might be more like a lab setting, so your ergometer might be more precise. For the VO2 max, we know that it is by the methodology itself. We know that there's approximately 1 to 1.2% more inaccuracy in the VO2 max in a PPD if you do it entirely without lactate. If you do the PPD with lactate measurements for the VO2 max, then this is on par with the lactate testing. Hannes, quick question here or clarification. How is it Submaximum testing less time consuming? Well, I was not referring to doing a 15-second sprint. So of course, if you do a 15-second sprint to a Submaximum test, you could argue that the 15-second sprint test is shorter. Well, what I was talking to, but I will come back to the comparison with the 15 seconds. I was talking to if you use the current INSCYD lactate testing protocol where you have an effort, recovery, effort, recovery, effort, recovery, the step test is obviously much faster. Doing the sprint test only, however, let's talk about this. The original protocol is 10, 15 minutes warm up, 10, you maybe want to do 5 minutes passive rest, doing the sprint test, and then measuring lactate post-effort for 10 minutes. So yes, the net exercising time is only the warm-up and the 15-second sprint. So total time in the lab is like almost 30 minutes. And now if you think about it, you do a 15-second sprint with a more than questionable methodology in terms of pre-post lactate divided by some unknown time duration. And it takes you an effective time with warm-up, with rest, and with lactate testing. It takes you effective time of 25 to 30 minutes. And it will take you approximately 11 to 13 lactate strips. With the step test protocol, you can do with the same amount of lactate strips, with the same amount or a little bit less time, you can get the VLamax and everything else, the full metabolic profile, VO2 max, MLSS, fat, carb combustion, everything. So that sounds like a no-brainer, right? Not doing any sprint testing here. Okay. Ran out of questions. If there's more questions, contact us. Okay. I'm going to close the Q&A session hereby. Koffi, thanks a lot for that exciting presentation.
Thanks, Sebastian, to you.
I think you should repeat that. And thanks everybody for joining and for the great questions. That was fun. And again, if there's more questions, either as an existing user, you know how to contact us. And if somebody is more interested in getting to know the methodology better or see how you could use it, or you have questions on how it works or how to apply it, then you have the QR code here. You can just go and book a demo where you can discuss all these questions, address all these questions. Thank you, and see you next time. Cheers.
Ciao, ciao.